Hey everyone, Ariel Adams here with Superlative Podcast. Be sure to listen to aBlogtoWatch's other podcast, aBlogtoWatch Weekly, where we talk about the latest news and reviews. Today on Superlative, my guest is founder of Typsim Watches, Matt Zinski. Matt, welcome.
Ariel, thanks for having me, and I'm excited to be here.
So the one term that stuck out when we were chatting a little bit about your journey and the watch brand that you do was you're a designer, you're a design lover. And I think this is very important because as a brand founder, everyone has a different reason for starting. And even within the sort of, I'll call it category or interest of design, it's hard to say that's a profession because it's many professions, right? There is a specific type of watch that comes out of it, as opposed to someone who purchased or acquired a wonderful name, or someone who wants to sell to a specific type of demographic. And so when thinking about the origin story of not just a watch or a brand, it's important to look at what was the person or people behind it, what were their goals, what were they interested in. So I guess we'll start here. Show me your designer spec sheet. What makes you someone who not only knows about design, but someone worth listening to about design?
Sure. So I'm an architect, and this is my profession. This is what I've been doing for the last quarter century. And in my career as an architect, I've always sought out the best design, highest design, wanting to design more. And my brand, Typsim, my company, this was founded in a basement in Buffalo, New York in 2006 maybe. And it was a extracurricular design and pursuit with myself and a couple of other architect friends. And we would, it was basically a design collaborative. And from that point onward, whatever we did on our day job as an architect, we would design, we'd work, we'd do our architecture, and we'd come home at night and we'd design more. And we'd pursue design competitions, design objects, design furniture, anything to do with design.
So it wasn't necessarily a watch. It was just something that's not a building.
Yeah. So right away, that's what it was. It was all about design. And so that kind of kept me going throughout my career, was extracurricular design pursuits. And I allowed it to morph. I got into graphic design with it, object design, so furniture, small scale art installations, continued that onward. And I allowed it to become a part of what was a passion of mine, which is watches. And I allowed the merging of my growing work on watches to blend with what I was doing on the side for design. And so that's kind of the complicated intersection of how design became watch design. Typsim became a watch brand.
I'm going to ask you a question that I ask many designers, but there's always a different answer. And that is, why do watches as a category hold such big interest for designers, different types of designers around the world? There might be some very obvious answers, of course, but I'd love your perspective on why watches as a product category is just so fascinating to folks like you.
Yeah, so I'm going to answer this in a complicated way, kind of backtrack to what I think about design. And I think design is one of the most, it's a very old pursuit. It's something, when I look at architecture, I'm a part of a lineage that's thousands of years old, ever since the primitive hut, and somebody was taking posts and beams, putting together roof, walls, and building space out of material. And I think design has moved through time with a trajectory that has embraced architecture, has moved to art, has moved to object design. And I think when we've gotten to watches, I can see a lot of parallels between the design of a watch and the design of architecture, albeit very different. There's still, I think, similarities. And so when you're designing a watch, you're designing a very functional object, just like architecture. It needs to function. You're designing something that embodies, I think, time and space when you start to design that watch. And then you're imbuing it with a certain amount of style or nowness. What is the contemporaneous way to express that watch now? And so I think design, watches, why do they capture my attention, at least, or I think designers, is they're kind of a little microcosm of how we express ourselves as humans and create objects that represent that. objects that capture that, and they're objects that tell our story. Just like again, I'm going to go back to architecture, but architecture I think tells our story, and it allows us to embody that.
So I'm going to throw out a really left field question here related to what you just said about architecture tells our story. And I think about many archaeologists who try to infer great amounts of information about entire societies and cities based on what remains of just some structures. And they're able to come to a lot of conclusions. Now, I've always likened watches to buildings. I've always considered them to be tiny little buildings. Yes, there's differences, but I think there's also a lot of parallels there as well. So the question is, thousands of years from now, people found our watches from today. Do you think they'd be able to learn about who we are, or would they be highly confused if they just looked at our timepieces?
Oh, I think it depends if they stumble across some of the, let's call them the hype artistic pieces, or if they come across a Timex or whatever is the quintessential watch of our era. And I think they'd learn from us. I think they would understand how we measure time, how we observe time, how it was connected to us kind of infinitely. We've always got a time on our wrist, or in a pocket, wherever it is.
I think of them a little bit like how we would find cutlery from people, whether it's a sword or a stone axe or something like that. But it was a tool that everyone seemed to have some version of, right? And likewise, not everyone, but around the world throughout history, many people have had different watches on them because it's sort of something that everyone has had. So it would be interesting in the future if there are enough of these around, if they're trying to come to conclusions about. I always wonder about these things because, like you said, so much design and effort comes into it. Sometimes if you just see the product, it's difficult to tell. You need to have the background. And I think fine art is sometimes the same way. When you just see the outcome, it's not as impactful if you hear the story from the artist about why it was made and how it was made, what they were thinking about when they were making it. You know what I mean?
I think that's incredibly important, but sometimes I wish it wasn't important. I think
agree.
Some of the most powerful art is the one that moves you, or you can infer or interpret the meaning or the concept or what was behind it. So maybe I'm on the fence on that one. I like hearing the story, but I also like things that stand alone.
Well, I'll tell you what it comes down to is I don't think most people have the interest in learning the story themselves. If it's not spoon-fed to them, they're just going to not care. It's no ding against their personality. They just don't have the incentive to dive deep. And there's a certain classification of curious individuals. I'm one of them. You're probably one of them as well, who without any particular outside stimulus says, oh, I'm intrigued by this. I want to learn more about it, where I've learned that's not normal behavior. You know what I mean?
Well, I think that's the behavior of a designer. Maybe, Ariel, you're a designer too. I think
at heart, probably.
I think the most successful designers are the ones that want to dive deep. They want to learn more, but they observe. They look at whatever the precedent is, whatever the design parameter is. So let's say you're looking at dive watches from the 50s, and there was an imperative to do a certain thing, to do a certain function. If somebody just wrote that on paper and you had to design to it, I don't think it would be the same as going out and testing this and observing the divers and observing what happened and looking at the nuances to make a successful design.
Designing watches is challenging. And I have learned that myself as I've dissected the process, and I've also watched a whole variety of designers do them. When you first started to try to design a watch, forget when you started getting into watches as a hobby, when you first started to design it, what were some of the initial things going on? Were you like humbled, like, wow, this is hard, or like, wow, I got this right away? I'm just curious, as a designer, what were some of the emotions that you went through in that initial phase?
It's, I think, excitement. Excitement was probably the feeling. I think this is, well, I'm gonna back up. I'm gonna say it's excitement with a certain amount of designer's frustration. And so when I sit down with a design problem, I like to, let's say, get into the zone, really focus on it, really understand the problem, and start to iterate and sketch and go over and over and over again. And it's a process that I go through so that I can test a lot of solutions in a short period of time. And it's exciting. It's thrilling to kind of work through that process. But like I said, there's a certain designer's frustration that as you're working through the process, you have this certain building stress of, am I going to hit that solution? Am I going to find that thing that feels like it's right and start to develop it?
Give an example, maybe you can share. It's a bit ambiguous, I think.
Sure. So I think when I start with dials quite often when I'm designing. And so I'll start to apply indexes and start to design the proportions and the sizes. And I might go, let's say I look at a triangle or a circle or a square index. And as I start to apply it, I start to see that there's a balance or there's a hierarchy or there's a relationship between the markers that makes sense to me. And as I start to observe that, I start to build on it and iterate into the next. Does that index want to be a larger circle or smaller circle? Does it want to shift a millimeter this way, that way? And I look for those, but sometimes you work through that and you think you're onto an idea, but it dead ends. It doesn't come together. And so you back up and then you start to iterate and start to develop the next path on that dial that with the larger indexes, let's say, or the smaller ones, and then see what that builds on itself.
Now, I'm fascinated when you say you hit a dead end. I think a lot of people don't know when to quit and give up. In fact, in the entertainment industry, for example, it's considered to be quite a good quality to know when a film, for example, or a script is just worthless and you should just drop it and cut your losses and move on. Maybe the stakes aren't as big in watches. Sometimes they are. When do you know when to just stop and say this isn't working? Is it an emotional thing, or is there a scientific process? You're like, I've explored as many options as I have time for. I need to just figure something else out.
Yeah, I wish I had it to a science. I think I would be a millionaire designer if I created that scientific process. It's very emotional. It's very subjective. And as I work through the process, I think design is extremely difficult. But once you get to the end, you feel like it's almost inevitable. And so what I mean by that is you struggle to find solutions, you test out solutions. And when you start to see the end result, you think, aha, you have an aha moment. And you say, that seems so simple, that seems so easy, that seems so right. And so, like I said, it's kind of a feeling, it's very subjective, but you do feel that emotional connection to it.
Now, many of the people who I've met who've made their own watches or made their own brands come from a place where they've enjoyed many other watches. And then at some point they feel like there's a watch they want that they can't find. They probably looked very hard for it. And they just decide, I want to make the watch that I want. That's how much of this seems to begin. Does that represent your journey, or is it quite different?
No, I think that's... I wish I could say I was a unique person and it was different, but I think I'm very much in line. And I think that comes not from necessarily my watch collecting. I have a small collection. I enjoy it, but I'm a self-taught watchmaker and I've been building my repertoire of what I've worked on. And through that process, I think I've handled more watches than I could have ever imagined as a collector. And what's really kind of, I think, unique and interesting about that way of connecting with watches is I've been able to take them apart and observe how they're put together, how each component works together. I can measure components individually. And so it gives me a very strong insight into how have watches been put together? How do they come together? And what can I learn from that? What can I improve on that? And what can I change or build off of?
There is, of course, a line in terms of the people that found brands between those who are not watchmakers, self-taught or traditionally taught, and ones who are watchmakers. And it doesn't seem to necessarily imply that a brand is going to fail or succeed. But my question is, what do you think, especially a small brand, is much more capable of if the person running it is a watchmaker, has a strong understanding of watchmaking versus someone who is an enthusiast but simply does not? What special skills or talents, or maybe it allows you to see certain potholes that others just wouldn't see coming?
Yeah, I think I have a certain advantage and disadvantage. It's a double-edged sword. I working on watches, understanding the business of design. I think as an architect, I understand the business of coordinating with engineers, manufacturers. I'm like a do-it-all. I can see it all, I can do it all, and I work through all of it. And so I can start to understand. I think a good example is when a manufacturer says something to me that, oh, this case back's not going to work. It doesn't meet our specs. And I've got the wherewithal to say, well, what are your specs? Explain these to me. Let me see the calculations. And then I can start to either work with those, I can reverse engineer those, and I can push and design and evolve the engineering to work within those parameters. And so that, for me, I think is exciting. It's a benefit to knowing watches, knowing architecture, knowing how to work through that.
Do you have a strategy on getting them to entertain that? Because oftentimes when a supplier says they can't do something, it's more like they don't want to do something. How do you get them to want to do that?
I think this is very true. And I think I've learned working around the world is definitely different business languages. I think there are certain countries that when they say no a lot and they mean no. And that's about the end of the conversation. I think others get a little worked up and will express a lot of emotion with the no. But it's a bit, like you said, it's a negotiating technique of, I don't really want to do that. I'm gonna say no in a very vehement or emotional way. But once we back out of that and we have that chance to negotiate, we can come to terms with it. And I guess maybe this is my stubbornness, my persistence, but I will keep asking. I will keep inquiring into it and find ways to ask where I'm not trying to push them. I recognize it. I understand they're saying, no, I don't really want to do this. It's easier for us to do it this way. And so I try to position myself as to say, well, I'd like to understand this. So next time, or I'd like to do this. And then I might roll that into a revision to the drawings.
I want to point out that what you're discussing is perhaps the most important topic when it comes to how to make a good watch. Whether you're a startup brand or you have your own team of employees and your own factory with machines and stuff like that, no matter what the situation is, for you to make a new product fundamentally means you need to make new stuff. And there's always pushback on that. Nobody wants to do anything new ever. They would like to do something they've done before to be rewarded. To do something new is difficult and untested, and nobody really wants to do it, even if it's your own employees and your own team. And so the practice of making a new watch, it doesn't end with designing it. It begins with designing it. It ends with somebody actually agreeing to make it at the right price, or you actually receiving it, right? And being like, oh, I'm happy to repeat this process. To get that is a process of persistence. As you said, you're someone that doesn't take no lightly. You and some other people like you who have your own specific set of attributes go around pushing people in the manufacturing category to make something they haven't done before, because that's what the consumers want. The consumers want new art, and they want new art all the time. And factories want to do the same thing, and they want to do the same thing all the time. I can't tell you how many factories I've been to. You've been to enough yourself, where they were proudly saying, we've been doing things the same way for 40 years. And I'm just like, oh my God, that's a terrible thing to say. At least as a Californian who's, accustomed to technology companies that would never be got dead doing the same thing for 40 years. So I think it's important not to underestimate how crucial it is of just getting someone to do that thing you want them to do, which is different than they've done it before. You should actually open every conversation when it comes to watch design. It's like, everybody, we're going to do something different. You don't know what it looks like yet. You don't even know how you're going to make it yet. But we all have to agree it needs to get done, or this conversation is going nowhere, right?
It's so true. And this has been a part of the struggle or the journey of building a watch brand, is finding the right people that will, even if they say no right away, will work with you, will negotiate with you and do something different. Even better, you find the people that say yes. I think one of the exciting people I've met is Albert over at RC Tritech, or Superluminova. And I went out to him and I reached out to him to talk about how could I make a luminous material that's going to change color over time. And so he jumped on the opportunity. He's one of these people that wants to continue to innovate. He wants to develop new things. He wants to work with brands, work with owners.
Are we talking like a planned patina?
You got it.
Okay.
Yeah. So the loom material on Typsim watches, it's all this this mixture that I developed with Albert, where it will, with UV light, with time, with age, it's going to patina.
Give me a few more concrete examples of this persistence and stubbornness in action. I know that there's a story of you getting your version of chronometer certified. There's also the story of the dual time module that you had created. Not only it didn't exist before, but you had it created in the United States. I want to hear those stories. But enter into this topic of you making the decision. Because again, this is not a cheap or pain-free way of going about making watches. Talk about making the decision to do these new things, and then maybe talk about those two stories and others. I'm fascinated hearing about them. Yeah.
I think so. One story. I'm not going to drop a name here because it's a little bit in negotiation still. But I reached out to a Swiss brand and I explained that I wanted to do a perpetual calendar, and they make them, and they said, "Well, no." I abruptly, or that kind of abrupt answer, it didn't sit well with me, and I had to find out, well, why can't we work together? And they let off that we don't work with people that build outside of Switzerland. We especially don't work with people that are manufacturing anything out of Hong Kong and China. And I said, okay, I understand, but what's the concern? And so I had to continue persisting till they would admit that the concern was they didn't trust that the watchmaker or person building the watches knew what they were doing. And so with all of the fine tuning and precise measurements, if it wasn't someone that understood that, their reputation was on the line, that it would be a perpetual calendar that would fail. Further, if the manufacturing tolerances weren't correct, again, it would fail. So I went on and it was like a job interview. I laid out what I've done as a watchmaker. I explained to them that I am currently working on their perpetual calendars. I'm servicing those watches. I'm currently working on other repeaters and complicated watches that require quite a bit of finesse. And so I demonstrated my capabilities as a watchmaker and explained that that's what I'm doing here. I'm building these watches. I would be assembling these. And I went one step further and I sent him a Typsim watch and I said, take a look. I know that you're concerned about the quality, but I'd like you to take it apart. I'd like you to take a look at it and understand that I'm insisting on a certain amount of quality control in these watches. And I'm not a drop shipper or someone that's not even paying attention to this. And so it was through this persistence, through demonstrating to them through this interview process that I was capable. And they finally said, you know what? I think, yes, let's continue the conversation. I think we can work together. And I think if I took that hard no from the beginning, none of that would have happened. And that's how it's been for the other stories that you're asking about, the chronometer certification, the dual time watch.
Do you think that the concerns of the Swiss brand were reasonable? Obviously, there's a protectionist element there. They have their industry. They don't want other people to be able to do it. They want there to be prestige for them and their friends and their neighbors, and anyone out of the country is not considered one of those things. But in general, given this discussion, this experience, do you think that there was a legitimate concern, or was it mostly based upon this protectionist urge?
The negative or cynic in me thinks there's a lot of protectionism there, but I do think it's warranted. I think that if you're 100, 200-year-old Swiss brand that's doing very good work, and someone comes and wants to work with you, if they're not doing the work that's up to the quality that you have demonstrated over your tenure, I think they have all the right in the world to say, well, I need you to show me that you will meet our quality requirements so that our reputation isn't dragged through the mud.
There have been a lot of experiences out there of even those brands coming out with watches that don't work. So I can understand why that's a concern for them. It's a strange thing because the industry works on the basis of many companies working together. Yet there's also this basis of kind of snobbiness that comes with it, where they're like, oh, I don't want to work with you, even though you want to work together. So this sort of goes to the other part of the conversation about how it's hard to get your stuff done. Sometimes they just don't want to do it because you're not seen as a buddy or a friend. So you have to prove that you're a buddy or a friend, or we have enough values in common or something like that to get them to do that type of work, to open up to that type of relationship. And I think that's one of the more interesting things about creating a brand. I know I've interviewed many people that have worked at brands that have, as you said, been around for 100, 200 years, and plenty of folks like you that have become autodidacts and learned themselves how to do it. And the interesting thing is that both sides have something to bring to the table. Like you intersect with watchmaking, but you come from sort of a motivated amateur background, and they come from this sort of like, they have the formal schools, their grandfathers are in it as well. They come from the culture, and it's very, very convenient for them. And I think it's quite interesting that these two worlds can interact. It's almost like highly professional orchestra musicians chatting with people that are like learning to play guitar and having something in common. It all helps contribute to make good music, right?
I totally agree. I think that I think there's always something to be offered in design, and I understand that like architecture, watchmaking isn't just design. There's a tremendous component of engineering. But what I think is what makes this a beautiful art form is the fact that it's the intersection of design and engineering. And so if somebody's up and coming and they are self-taught and they're a guitarist that's playing rock music and you're doing orchestrated, beautiful orchestra pieces, I think that's okay. I think there's something to learn from the enthusiasm, the design, the engineering ideas that might come out of that self-starter versus what's known, what's established, what's calculated.
So you told me a little bit about the story about chronometer certification. Obviously, the overall purpose of all this is to show people that your watch is accurate and performs well. That's why these certifications have been popular for a long time, because the architecture of the movement itself matters less than the specific way it was assembled and how it's regulated. So for a very, very long time, each individual watch that was supposed to perform well needed to prove by itself that it performed well. It couldn't just be one in a series. Today, it's more of an enthusiast thing. People obviously like accuracy, but it's not as crucial, especially for scientific and navigational purposes and things like that, where this is where it came from. But what were you trying to accomplish with such certification? What roadblocks did you hit, and what was your solution in the end? Yeah,
I think my pursuit of that it's a little bit self-interested. I'm a watch nerd through and through, and I love the data, the paperwork, the element of having gone through the test and saying that this watch has passed the test. That's it's very exciting to me. And so for me to start a watch brand, I had to pursue passing that test to demonstrate that the watches could do that. So that's coming from the watch geek in me. On the other side of it, I really wanted to push what I developed as a watch to be the best thing possible and show that I could be taken seriously about what I was trying to achieve. I naively got into it thinking that I could talk to Solita, ask them to get COSC for me, get the movements, they'd be COSC certified, and it wouldn't be as difficult as a process. I very quickly learned that COSC doesn't do anything with a non-Swiss brand. And so I was immediately shut out of getting it done the way that Swiss companies get it done. And that's to have the movement certified and then sent over to somebody to build the watch.
Again, protectionism or something else?
I think that one's a little bit protectionism, to be honest. So with that roadblock in place, I had to find another place to get certified. And so at the time that I was pursuing this, 2019, I think there was only 2 other places in the world that I was able to discover. This was Wempe and Glashütte, and then
Germany,
Besançon Observatory in France. And I apologize, my accent is terrible. And so in reaching out to them, it was Besançon that was willing to work with me to get the watches certified. I think through this challenge, I discovered the opportunity of working with Besançon and found that they're a historic observatory that's been working through time trials and competitions since the 146, 172 years ago. And they've been in operation continuously, certifying and testing watches since then.
Can we explain, this is, I think, quite interesting, maybe a bit too nerdy for some people, but most people don't think of the term observatory as being synonymous with timekeeping, yet the history of course, watching the sky and using that to test whether or not watches work. Obviously, a lot of the way we keep time is based upon astronomical things. Talk about how this astronomical heritage and timekeeping device testing, how did those intersect?
So obviously there was no such thing as an atomic clock 150 years ago. And for someone to find something stable enough to time and compare to the timing of the watch fell onto astronomy or observation of the celestial bodies. And so Besançon Observatory is someone who uses something called a transit telescope, which observes a celestial body passing by a marker. And through mathematical calculations that I have no idea about, they know what that specific time will take for that to pass through the observation of the telescope. And so they can use that to make a mark and understand whether that watch is timing where it needs to be, fast, slow, etc. And so they have a history in that, and this is why observatories were doing it. It was the most precise way to calculate and observe time.
Now, that's not still done today, right? They're not using a telescope to determine this?
No. They're a part of the Worldwide Atomic Clock program. I'm not exactly sure what it's called, but they're one of the atomic clocks that makes sure that there is a universal time kept to high
Okay,
standards.
so it's the same. I wonder if they still have a telescope, right? But now they've replaced it with an atomic clock. So they have their own atomic clock,
yep.
And that's what they use to compare other timepieces against.
Well, they do.
That's their reference clock.
They definitely do have the telescope. So in attempting to get my chronometers, I had planned this all out to have a courier hand deliver these for me, and had it all figured out until the courier fell through the week before they were set to be delivered. And so myself going through, at the time we were in the midst of COVID, not thinking about travel, I allowed my passport to expire. And I was buying a ticket to France 2 nights before I flew out, getting my passport the day of, and hand delivering these to Besançon myself.
Wow.
And so stressful, but at the same time, it was kind of awesome to fly out to France to see the historic telescopes, to see how that telescope sits on a foundation that's not touching any other part of the earth and goes down something like 5 stories. It's a phenomenal historic place. And then to see the technology that they're using to test the watches themselves, while it's not the historic, it's still it's pretty phenomenal to see.
And how is that similar or different to how they do it at COSC in Geneva in Switzerland?
I think it's probably, they're still using the same, I think it's the high-resolution video observation of the watches. And so what they'll do is they have a temperature, humidity controlled safe that the watches are positioned and locked in for 24 hours. They're pulled out once a day to do the winding and to do the observation, which is through a digital videography that takes a precise snapshot, high resolution, to observe where the second hand is. And so as I understand it, COSC is doing the same thing, albeit on a much larger scale. And I think it's even automated with robotic assistance.
Yeah, I think that's so important to say because most people really don't know how that works. And there are different ways of observing a watch these days. The 2 most common ones are the optical system, as well as an audio-based listening system, where if you know the frequency of the movement, a microphone can listen to the watch and very, very quickly tell you what the accuracy and stuff is. Watching the hands is a slightly different process, but it compares where the hands are to where it thinks it should be, and it can tell you the deviation over time. And as you said, a lot of this can be done in an automated way, whereas there are a bunch of basically robotic trays and arms that move around, and human intervention is minimal. it does take a little bit of time, but it's not terribly expensive because, again, it's not necessarily a labor extensive process. But it is a very interesting thing, and I'm glad we're talking about it, because I could be wrong, but I don't think most people understand how accuracy, especially in that scale, is tested, right?
Yeah. I think I think COSC is, like you said, it's an incredibly mass-produced, automated testing process. What I think is kind of cool about the Besançon Observatory is it's a very hands-on process. One of their staff is the one that's taking these out, moving them around, observing them, working with the software to do the digital snapshot. And they still have the hand ledgers. They still do the handwritten cards that identify the watches as chronometers.
Oh, they write the little report on there?
And so I got to see some of the historic ledgers, and it really feels significant to know that my brand name is in their ledger now. And as it's even the first American company that's even gone over there to do this process.
Why are there so few places that do this? Is this something about the process? It's just, now that I didn't really thought about it, but now that you had mentioned it to me, it's true. Other than the German watches, unless you're a Swiss watch, you're not going to have any type of real certification. You might have a super accurate movement, but to have a third party say this is an accurate movement is something you can't find at all. I don't know how much that allows people that want to buy a watch more, but it's kind of interesting to think about how there's a relatively narrow segment of the market where such services are even available, right?
Well, I think I think I'll speculate a little bit on the history, but it was here in America. We were testing them at naval observatories. But
yeah, like 100 years ago.
Right. And I think as things have progressed, one part on the economic side of it, where the Swiss brands took over. And so we didn't have American watchmaking, but it moved over to Switzerland. I don't think there was quite the need to do that work here. I think we were past the war. We were past the watchmaking boom in America, and it moved overseas. I think the other side of it, obviously, as we produce quartz movements and highly accurate computers and electronic watches, there's just not that same need to test against an observatory or a third party.
I guess that's why we still call it the old world, because Europe loves to keep these industries alive, even if they're not entirely relevant. And America, for the last 100 years, has just been like, everything's on the chopping block, like not state of the art, not grow and kill it. And now we're like, we can't make anything here.
Yeah, tough times. But I think that's a great segue. I mean, I'm trying to do something. I'm trying to bring things back. I'm trying to learn to do that myself. And my first step in was working with Zach Smith. He's with Hours Precision. He's out of Ohio, and he's a watchmaker and micro mechanic. I think might be the right term. And so yeah.
Well, yeah. What were you trying to do here? What was the need? Let's start with that.
So the need for me is I wanted to create a dual time or travel watch. And I think when I look at it, I think Rolex did it right. I think what they did with the 6542 GMT Master way back when, it's a phenomenal watch. And I think the application, the 24-hour hand, is terrific. But when I wanted to make my version of a travel or dual time watch, I didn't want to copy that thought process. And so I was really trying to find what felt right to me. And I really leaned into what Patek did with, now I'm going to forget the reference, but they had their Calatrava with the two 12-hour hands. And I found that to be extremely compelling as a way to tell two different time zones on a single watch. And so I wanted to create a dual time watch that kept track of two 12-hour hands on the same dial, same central post. And I wanted one of the hands to be able to jump around and tell a reference time. And so this is where I think I've started to differ from what like an Omega jump hour or the Patek travel times do, where they jump the local hand, is I wanted to jump the reference hand. And I wanted this to be, I guess, it's kind of honest to how I think about travel or telling two time zones. I travel as much as I can, but it's short stints. And when I travel, that doesn't feel, it's ephemeral. It's a temporary 1 week, 2 week vacation. And when I travel, I want to reference the time I'm at, but always know what home is. On the flip side of that, when I'm where I am here in Seattle, I have family out in New York. I like to just keep track of both times so that I've got a reference point over to New York. And so for me, this made a lot of sense to have a jump hour of the reference time as opposed to the loomed primary hand.
Okay. So for you, the travel was secondary. What's going on at home was primary.
Right.
Okay. And instead of having a hand that was geared to go around the dial once every 24 hours, it was once every 12 hours as the fourth hand.
You got it. Yeah.
Okay. And so what was the process of getting that done?
So I thought the process would be, again, talk to Solita, ask them if they could create a modification for me and we could do some kind of a mechanism. And it was kind of a hard no. They don't do that. And they said, go talk to some other manufacturers, some of the third parties that do modifications. And
wait, why would they say no? It sounds right up their alley.
I thought it would be, but apparently not. I can't tell you exactly why. Maybe I'm too small production. But I continue to reach out to Sebastian, to reach out to Miguel and ask them, can we do something? Let's push. And I'll keep trying and we'll see what comes of it. But with that no, it was then just reaching out to these other third-party manufacturers that do modifications or modules and asking.
And there's not that many of them. I mean, there's a few, but there's not that many.
No, there's not too many. And it was conversations where they said, oh, maybe we can do that. It might take a year or two to work through it. And I stumbled upon someone who referred me to Zach Smith. And it was another watchmaker here in Seattle, Elena. And she said he's terrific. He's done all sorts of modifications. He's created parts. He knows how to do it all. She talked to him. So I reached out to Zach, and he was fully enthusiastic to work on the project and was gung-ho to get started. And I found in him a collaborator to push to do things here in the US and to do them enthusiastically and to do them quickly and see what we can make happen. And so with him, I came up with my kind of rudimentary design solution. He worked through the engineering to refine it so it would work better, work period, I should say. And from there, he manufactured prototypes and we made something happen.
Let's be clear with people about exactly what we're talking about. You begin with a base movement, which does not need to be changed, not really. And then you add a layer on top of it, which is often known as a module. And this takes the positions of the hands and the power and creates a slightly different display. Maybe adds something, maybe changes something. It's able to use, as I said, the power of the base movement. You just need to make sure that there's low enough friction and stuff like that. Sometimes you lose a little bit of power, but you're essentially adding a sandwiched layer, another slice of the movement sandwich, right? Yeah.
So in this case, it's not a full-on module that's sitting on top of it, but it's doing modifications to a few of the gears and mechanisms that are on top of it.
So you're replacing some parts? Is that how it works?
Yeah, replacing.
Okay, so a similar situation, but you take a stock movement rather than adding to it. You take some of the stock parts out, you add your own.
You got it. That's it.
Okay, so now getting this stuff designed is one thing. Getting it produced, yes, if you do sort of like a one-off thing, some guy with a bunch of special machinery can do it. Where is the module actually made now?
Well, it's going to be made with Zach. And so this is the brilliance
so he's going to make it.
Working with him is he's a micromechanic, and he does this at scale for very large scientific, medical, and space industry.
Oh, so he's got all that stuff at his disposal. Okay, that answers
it. So when we talk about doing it, he's thinking, how can I do this at scale for you?
Okay. So I'm just curious because I have intellectual property background. What are you guys sharing the ownership here? How do you work all that out?
We've got what's the name of it? I'm forgetting tonight. It's I've got the head start on it, and so he's gonna work with me. He's gonna work with me only for the first couple of years, and then past that, we're gonna negotiate what it would be if somebody else wants to have this manufactured with him.
Okay, so he's obviously has some ownership of it. Do you have any ownership of this? I mean, all you can really do is patent it. That only lasts a certain amount of time.
Right. And we agreed that we would put out a joint patent on it. So we've got the application.
Okay, so you're both going to be on there. Okay, I was just curious because when you're inventing stuff, I know the Swiss story, but as we've talked about, this happens so infrequently in America.
Right. Yeah, so I think it's been a good working relationship, and I'm excited for Zach to see a benefit from this, me to see a benefit from it, and I think it's pretty cool working with him.
So if somebody comes along and says, Mr. Zinski, sir, we love your module. Can we buy it and use it in our watch? What are you going to say?
I'm going to say, I'm going to call Zach up and say, Zach, these guys want to buy it. Let's get you to make it, and let's do a commission for me, and we'll figure something out.
So you're open-minded to licensing this out and selling these parts?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. Do you think, and again, this goes back to the Made in America thing. I've known many, many people who over the last 15, 20 years have been quite interested in bringing some form of watchmaking back to America. And there's a lot of disparate parts here and there around the country. There's a lot of things missing. We sort of glossed over the fact that in the United States, most precision manufacturing is either not precise enough or has so little interest in a project where you need, 50 parts. They're like, call me when you need 500,000 parts, right? Yeah. That is, it's not that it's not worth their time intellectually. It's just from a business perspective, they're like, but I have people that need me to make thousands of parts. I don't understand how you want me to fit this in unless you're going to pay a fortune, which I wouldn't even want to charge you because that's ridiculous. So there is a very real barrier, not an intellectual or a training barrier in the United States, but an actual industrial manufacturing barrier where stuff cannot be made because it practically cannot be made. And that is something which takes more than just persistence to get. You have to find a business model that allows for such factories to be able to do so. Is that feasible?
I think about this a lot, and I would love it to be feasible. But I think until there's, like you say, enough demand for it. So if it doesn't make sense to make 50 because you need to make 1,000, that kind of means that you've got a customer for 1,000. But let's say you had 20 customers for 50. Maybe that can start to make sense. I don't know if the demand is there in either case necessarily. And I won't speak for Zach completely, but I know that he's a watch enthusiast, a watch guy through and through. And so when projects like this come through, he's so enthusiastic to help make it happen. But I know that at the end of the day, he's still doing these precision mechanics for other industries that are at scale, that are, I speculate, very financially viable.
Yeah. Down the road, if you want to suggest him to come on the show, I'd love to chat with him about these topics. I don't know how many people are interested in the American manufacture of small precision components, but I'm down for the topic.
Yeah, definitely.
Let's go back to the brand, because this is obviously a conversation. People can't see it. You have a good eye for design. The Typsim name, where does that come from? And also the logo, which reminds me of the London Underground.
Oh, interesting. It all comes from my architecture background. And so Typsim is a combination of two architectural abbreviations, TIP and SIM. TIP being typical, SIM being similar. And I kind of brought those abbreviations together to kind of create the name. And then
so there's a bit of a comedic element there.
There you go. And then on the building on that even further, the logo is something that I came up with when I shifted to focus on watch design through Typsim, and I wanted to use the reference mark. So in architectural drawing, we use that split circle as a way to indicate where you need to reference other details.
I see. So it's supposed to say, look at this. This is a focal point.
Right.
Now, you have a few watches. I don't know where you started, but I'm guessing it was the Diver. Is that where you started?
It is, yeah, the Diver.
A lot of brands start with the Diver. Why? I mean, I love divers. You love divers. Tell other people who don't love divers, why is it great to start with a Diver?
Boy, it was divers have been my god on my go anywhere, do anything kind of watch. And again, starting Typsim, I had a couple of young kids, and more often than not, I was getting wet. I was abusing watches. I was doing whatever it took to take care of my kids, and the watch was just there as a part of that. And so for me, the dive watch is kind of the ubiquitous tool watch that can endure whatever you throw at it. I think you can argue that field watch, pilot's watch, that most modern watches, in fact, can probably do the same. But I think there's something very rugged, durable, and out of mind about a dive watch.
I'll add a funny story. And I heard this from Omega, so if it's not true, then someone lied to me. But it has to do with the history of the Seamaster. And the Seamaster originally, I think, came out in the 1950s, was never supposed to be a professional serious dive watch. It was actually intended as, this is the words that were used for me, a wealthy person's weekend watch that could get wet while they're playing with their kids. And look sporty enough, but still be sort of luxury enough and not necessarily be the weekday suit watch. And I always remembered that as being like, there, even back then, it was acknowledged that there was a guy that really just wanted a watch that could put up with his kids, wanted to still look at his wrist and feel like a big shot, knew it wasn't the watch he was going to necessarily wear to work. That was like their version of a luxury beater watch, kind of in the 50s. And then, of course, the Seamaster turned into a professional dive watch, but only later, which is a complete opposite route of most other watches, where they started as a serious tool and then they became a little bit more lifestyle-y. That's kind of funny, right? I
really hope that story is true. I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah. So, okay. So that, going back to the diver, and this is the beauty of a diver is everyone loves it. The challenges of a diver is there's so many. It's really the small details that distinguish them, even at the same price point. Wow, is it hard to tell? So what did you want to get right? What were your favorite features in watches in general that you knew you needed to be in there? For someone who isn't seeing this, describe why they would be interested in this, $1,000 to $2,000 dive watch, more so than the many, many other $1,000 to $2,000 dive watches out there.
Yeah, well, I'm going to start with the design style or aesthetic first. And when I designed the Typsim 200M, the dive watch, I wanted to think about what was quintessential to my watch face that wasn't done before, what hasn't been done. If I wanted to face up against Tudor, Rolex, Omega, Blancpain, and they all have very quintessential dial styles, even Seiko I'll throw in there. And where I found myself is I hadn't seen anybody use exclusively circular indexes of different sizes to differentiate the 12, the 3, 6, and 9, and then the various hours. And so I really leaned into how I would design to be my watch design, my quintessential diver. Going beyond that, I think some of the features that were really critical to me was wearability. What I love about vintage dive watches is they hug your wrist. They feel light. They feel comfortable. They have presence. They're legible. They're functional, but they don't feel like a modern diver. And that was what was so important to me, was how can I make this as thin as possible? How can I bring the case back tight against the wrist so that it doesn't teeter-totter up over your wrist?
And how did you accomplish that? Because I think you're talking about what I call as being top heavy, right? When the watch is, it's not really the weight, but if it's not snug enough, it kind of flops around, and it can make, even if the watch isn't big, it just make an uncomfortable experience. But it's good to hear what you were trying to accomplish. How did you go about doing that? Did you make a bunch of prototypes? Did you just see ones and kind of cobble together, like, I like this from this brand, I like this from this brand? Talk a little bit about the process of how you got to the end result.
This is where I'll go back to what I was talking about, design as observation. And so working on a lot of watches and observing how they built them and the details around them, I incorporated the details not because I saw it in the brand, but I saw it in the function. And so when you look at a watch that hugs the wrist, you see lugs that curve down and they don't stick out straight. You see things like chamfered edges around the edges of the case. You see steps in the case so that the case has a perceived slimness to it. And you see case backs that are very thin, they're very flat, and they push up into the case as opposed to really sticking out the backside. And I think it's a combination of those elements that really help it come down to the wrist.
I want to ask about the bracelet. I'm a bracelet guy. I love wearing dive watches on bracelets. And, there's only so many bracelets out there. There's like not that many. Yours is unique looking. It has some elements that are, of course, familiar, but it doesn't automatically look like all the other ones there. What were you trying to accomplish with the bracelet? What are some of the standout features there? What would impress me that I can't see just by looking at pictures of it?
Well, I think the thinness would impress you. I think if you were to go out to any microbrand show and you try it on their bracelets, they're going to be twice as thick as mine.
That's common, yeah.
And so it was, again, this is where the negotiations really went into the manufacture of this, is insisting on the bracelet get smaller and smaller and smaller to the point that I think I made them feel pretty uncomfortable with how far I brought the slimness down. And
uncomfortable, why?
Because they like to build in certain tolerances that the material is not going to fail. They're not going to be too thin.
So you're saying that the reason a lot of bracelets are as thick as they are is because there's worry that not enough material between the hole for the screw or whatever and the top of it, how it could damage.
That's part of it. I think the other part of it is the tooling and speed of manufacturing.
Okay. Yeah, because it seems to be like you can still make, metal's tough stuff, right? You don't need that much material to be secure. And we've seen some of those old bracelets that are thin, and they were not made, look at the old Rolex ones that like pull apart, right?
Exactly.
They were really worried about that. They would have done stamped, folded. I actually never published this, but this was years ago. I was planning on writing an article, and it was a comparison between a 1970s Rolex diver and a modern, like, $200 Seiko diver. Oh. And how in many instances the Seiko was a far better timepiece, and how much stuff they shared in common, like a cheap stamp, like a rolled metal stamped kind of bracelet links and things like that. And it's just, there was all this love and appreciation for these vintage divers. Like, if only people knew how crappy they were actually made compared to a lot of proper stuff. Would you say specifically your watch is vintage inspired, or is it rather that there's something that we used to do well with dive watches that we may not do as well anymore and it's worth revisiting?
I wouldn't say vintage inspired. I like to say that it's classically designed. And I think this is maybe the architect in me, but when you learn history, when you learn the design, the proportions, the rhythms of how a building's conceived, it's a classical education. And then as we become modernists, we break away from that, but we're still infused by a certain classic elements of design. And I like to think that as I approach watches, I'm coming at it a very similar way. Classic design elements that are informing how I do it.
What are the aspirations for the brand? Some people just want to have, a one human operation with maybe a couple of people to help them here and there. They don't want any full-time employees. And then on another extreme side of it, it's let's build as big of a brand as we can so we can sell it. And there's obviously a lot in the middle there. I'm not saying that your answer, you have to stick to it, or that it has any implication on the products or the trajectory. But just as a business person doing this, what appeals to you as a future direction? Well,
right now I'm very small production, and I would like to see my production maybe quadruple in the next few years. And I think it'll be a slow road to get there, but it's something that I'd like to see. And I'd like to see that because, well, I just like to see the watches on more people's wrists. I think that's the goal for me. And what I hope to achieve by slowly building capacity and scaling up is I want to bring more here to America for manufacturing. I want to bring more here that I can work on personally. And so I'm very aspirational and enthusiastic to continue working with people like Zach Smith. Right now, I'm eyeing up and seeing what the cost is to bring in dial manufacturing here to my Seattle studio and start to do the dials myself. And so I see these as incremental steps to the point where I can be building a small-scale watch operation that's very much housed here in America.
A lot of people in the luxury industry acknowledge that the United States is probably going to be the most important market for watches in the foreseeable future. One of the things that coincides with that is having to do business in the United States and having to compete with other American businesses. And they can be sure that if they put a lot more focus on promoting watches and having stores here, that folks like you will not just become even more enthusiastic by your operations, but more could come. I think an interesting question is, how undeveloped do you think is the watch market in the United States still? Obviously, there's pockets of deep appreciation. My suspicion is that large parts of the United States would like watches if only they knew a little bit more about them, like maybe other hobbies or pursuits that they're interested in. What do you think are some of the growth potentials for the hobby in the United States?
Boy, good question. I agree with you. I think there's a lot of growth potential, and I see it in a couple of different market sectors in the United States. I think on the one hand, being America, I think we ultimately do have a very affordable marketplace. So and what I mean by that is if somebody comes out with a watch that's a couple of $100 and it's a very attractive design, very functional, I think that that's a market sector that is always room to grow and to thrive in America. I think on the other side of that, we obviously have a lot of luxury demand here. And so I think that there's a strong market sector for luxury items. And I do think that there is a bit of a missing middle that exists here that is maybe not as strong as the other two ends of the market sector, but I look at it maybe like salvage denim. That you have the stuff that you can go out and get at Gap or other very affordable places. You can go to a bespoke tailor in New York, LA, wherever it is, and you can get a pair that's thousands of dollars. But you can also go to these denim shops around the United States that are selling you something that's in the mid-range, and they're fantastic products, and they're quality that you're aspiring up to, and that you're maybe not going to go get the bespoke pair, but they're also at a price point that's well above the affordable side of it.
So there's a big area for growth, as well as the middle, which again we'll call it the middle class watch. In a lot of ways has gone away back to when Cartiers used to be more affordable. Right. I'm excited about what you're going to do next. I think that's a fantastic story about the travel time complication for the Time Traveler watch. And I'm looking forward to personally seeing some of your stuff. Matt, we're basically out of time, but can you tell people where to go on the internet to learn more about the Typsim brand as well as yourself?
Yeah, thanks. So you can check us out at our website, www.typsim.com. That's TYPSIM. And then you can also check us out on social media. That's at Typsim Watches. On Instagram, Facebook. I'm not on TikTok yet, but maybe soon.
Thank you so much. This has been the Superlative Podcast interview with Typsim founder, Matt Zinski. Matt, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Ariel.